Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Summit 7. I am so excited to be here. Ordinarily, I present a fair amount, and ordinarily I'm telling one compelling story. So this is a little bit different in presenting a report. I'm going to go through a handful of slides that present findings from a study that was done with Coal Fire and Kiteworks. And I would encourage you to keep track of the slide number that I'm on so that when it comes to Q&A, I can go back to slide number 3 or slide number 4, because if you say that they're, it's research projects typically are looking at the same data through multiple lenses. Think of turning a cube over and looking at it from different directions. So I'm going to talk about encryption and gap analyses and third-party controls and CUI and things like that. So that content is on every slide, so it's important to keep track of the slides if you want me to go back to something. But there's something to chew on every slide, and usually there's one compelling story that I'm going through, but these are like little short stories. Each one has its own, and something will strike you. So keep notes of what's interesting. Also, I ordinarily don't talk about myself, go through the bio, and I don't talk about the company that I'm with, but it's actually relevant to do so in this case very briefly. I'm Vice President of CMMC for Coal Fire Federal, which is a separate company from Coal Fire, and not everybody understands that. And this is a research study that was done by Coal Fire, and we're not like parent-child, we're more like siblings than anything, and it's also important that people understand that we're foci mitigated. We're the only ones that do federal work. We're the only ones that are a C3PAO, the federal house. And so we don't even talk to each other about certain things because of our foci mitigation. But Coal Fire Systems, who did this study, our sister company, actually does CMMC gap analyses and advisory work. They do not do assessment work. Only we do assessment work. And it gets even crazier in that we also do advisory work or assessment work for any given company. As you all know, if you're here, you can't be an advisor and an assessor for the same company. So all that to say that this is Coal Fire Systems research that I'm presenting, and they can only do advisory work if you're interested in talking to them about the gap analysis stuff. We also do gap analysis, but only for companies that do assessment work. If you use Coal Fire Systems for advisory work, you cannot use us for assessment work. So imagine living in that world and keeping that straight. But it was worth mentioning because I've gotten a few questions about posts on LinkedIn from Coal Fire, so I wanted the opportunity to unpack that. The other very quick personal thing, again, I never talk about myself, but it's relevant that not very many people in the room probably know that I started early on in my career as a college professor. So for 20 years, I was doing research related to how companies could improve their cybersecurity posture and that sort of thing. And then I got bored with that and left to be director of cyber for the New York Crime Commission, built the alliance with the FBI, went to work for the guy who was head of cyber for the FBI, built their CMMC practice, built their CIS practice, got headhunted for Coal Fire, and that's how I ended up here now. But as a recovering college professor, I'm well versed on research projects, statistics, and so even though this isn't my research, which feels a little fraudulent for presenting someone else's research, my academic background came in handy in slicing and dicing this in meaningful ways. So. Getting into the survey now, and I just want to also give you one disclaimer, is that I'm speaking at 4 different events on 4 different days, and so packing for that, I forgot some crucial things like my eyeglasses. So I might ask for audience participation to tell me what the hell's on the slide here. So the statistics are pretty interesting in that I can walk and talk, right? So I'm gonna get a little closer to the slide so I can see what I'm presenting. So it's a really good mix. So that a good mix of participants makes for interesting findings. You have a lot more to chew on if everybody doesn't look exactly the same in a research project. So 32% of the organizations surveyed were small businesses, 48 are medium-sized, and 20 are of larger size. And then there's also diversity in the leadership, which I really appreciated. 37% of the leaders surveyed were technical leadership, which you would expect that most of the people surveyed would be technical leadership, but it was 37%. So this is a nice number. 19% were executive leaders, and so I really appreciate that perspective as well. 23% were risk and compliance, and again, it's interesting that that's carved out as a separate entity and that doesn't overlap with legal and other. Because I don't know about you, but it seems like there's a lot of crossover in those, except for the executive leadership for most organizations. Okay, this is the one that I really needed my glasses for. So this is, we're going to look at how things look in different ways. So we're going to look at the same kinds of information, but from a few different perspectives. And this one is an interesting, compelling slice and dice of companies that did a gap analysis. So the yellow is the companies that have completed a gap analysis. The black is companies that are in process with a gap analysis, and the white are companies that have not completed a gap analysis. And the first category is they used a third party to help them with that. And so this might, I might sound like Captain Obvious on a couple of these earlier slides, but it kind of makes sense that if you have a champion, if you're going to the gym and you're meeting your personal trainer, you're a lot more likely to be successful than if you just say, I think I'll go to the gym today. So there's a bit of that. If you have a coach that really knows what they're doing, then you're going to probably be a lot more successful in completion of your gap analysis. The next category is about having a full and robust set of documentation. So if you've completed a full gap analysis, then you're more likely to have a full set of documentation. That seems like common sense, and that particular category, I would expect it to look exactly like that. The next category is about encryption and whether or not you've done a gap analysis, and so again, that looks kind of like what you would expect as well, I believe. Is that right? Was that the encryption one? Yeah, okay, thanks. And then this one I think is actually, you can say the glass is half full, the glass is half empty, or you can just recognize that there's water and a glass on the table. And this one, to me, is, it could be a little bit surprising or not surprising at all that if you haven't started a gap analysis yet, you do not have any POAMs. And yet, you would think that if anybody has any sort of cybersecurity hygiene at all, that they would have plans of actions and milestones towards doing better. So the fact that that is 0 for companies that haven't conducted a gap analysis was a little surprising to me, and also not surprising. And this is just, I'm going to go through a couple of these next slides very quickly. Key findings, whether or not there was a gap analysis, in 41% have done a gap analysis. Of the companies surveyed, 41% are in process and 22 have not started. This feels a bit like the conversations that we've all had at these CMMC events, I think. And then there's, you're 3.5 times more likely to have completed or be in process if you're working with experienced partners. 2.6 more likely to have fully documented policies if you've done a gap analysis. 1.8% better implementation of encryption standards, excuse me, if you've done a gap analysis, and 2.2 times more likely to have detailed POAMs. And to me, that number seems like it should be higher after looking at the last slide. So. And then this slide is another one I'm going to go through more quickly so we can get into a couple of the more meatier ones. But I think that the most compelling piece of this statistic is that of the companies that have fully documented, or that 61% have fully documented, 33% are somewhere there, and 3% have no documentation. But what's really interesting to me and aligns with what I've heard from OSCs as well as working in companies is that the cybersecurity leadership is reporting that 54% are fully documented, while the CEOs are saying 80% are fully documented, and that kind of tracks that. The CEOs believe that we're doing better than we are, but the people in the weeds who are looking at every single thing that needs to be done, and that's what keeps them up at night, they feel like they're a little more glass half empty than glass half full. Okay, and this is an interesting finding on the overall security link with documentation that companies that have fully documented, companies that are fully documented for their CMMC preparedness are 83% more likely to have fully implemented encryption. And you can read that a couple of different ways. You can say, oh, that's a high number, but also if you're fully documented, are you not fully prepared? And if you're fully prepared, shouldn't that be 100% implemented? So that's one interesting take on that. You could also imagine that maybe they're looking at documentation as policies and procedures in place, but they haven't completed all of their technical controls. Having not done this study myself, I can't, you can't. One of the things that I remember from being a professor is when you do this kind of research, you always wish, oh man, I wish I'd asked that question as a follow-up to get more insight into that particular thing, but we don't have that insight here. So we don't really know, but if you are fully documented, you're more likely to have robust encryption. Interesting again to see 0 here, that there's 0 encryption implementation for companies that haven't, they're minimally documented. And then the third-party access controls, to me, this is a meatier, more interesting, more fun sort of thing to look at. And this relates to, really CMMC is related to supply chain security. So the DoD flows something down to their prime contractors who flow things down to their thousands of subcontractors, and somehow or another that CUI information has to be shared. And so the third-party access controls are related to that. So companies that are fully documented, 75% of those have robust third-party controls in place for sharing information. One of the bits of the follow-up question that I wish they had asked is that up or down? So if you're a prime contractor and you're fully documented and you've got robust third-party controls, that should be 100% because you're flowing things down. So you need to have a good way to be sharing information. Smaller companies, they may get controls and they may get their requirements in a variety of different ways. They may not have CUI. They may only have FCI in their environment. Who knows? But it goes to show that the more documentation you have in place, the more likely you are to be doing well on all the dimensions of success related to CMMC. So 20% of the minimally documented organizations have effective third-party controls in place. So again, this feels to me kind of shocking. If you're conducting work that involves getting CUI and you don't have a secure way of either receiving or sharing that information, that feels like a frightening pain point right there. All right, so again, these are like little short stories. We're kind of moving on to a slightly different topic here, but this is the way the survey was conducted. And so this gives you a little more in-depth of the companies that have, how far along they are for conducting the gap analysis. And so the larger blue is they've completed a gap analysis. A gap analysis in progress is the next biggest block. So sorry. They haven't started their gap analysis is yellow, and then, that's complete. The yellow is the completed the gap analysis. No, I'm sorry. Yes, I was right the first time. The blue is the completed the analysis. I hate being blind. Gap analysis in progress is the black. Have not started is the yellow. And then the green is what's a gap analysis. So that's the one that's really problematic. And if you're in the DIB and you're receiving the survey and you're willing to respond to it and you don't know what a gap analysis is, that's pretty scary. Oh, thank you. Your engineers are amazing. Someone just blew that up for me so I could see it better. Okay, so, and then the next slide relates to encryption implementation and encryption maturity. So of the companies that are fully documented and conducting a gap analysis, the larger percentage, 69%, has fairly mature encryption in practice. So that provides a little bit of reassurance, because encryption is one of the trickier parts of CMMC for a lot of companies. A lot of companies know how to do some basic cybersecurity. They know that they need to have MFA in place. They know that they have to have security awareness and training. They know that they have to have policies and procedures, but encrypting data in transit is sometimes one of the trickier things, and the fact that it has to be FIPS validated, and that's tricky, and sometimes companies have more advanced encryption than FIPS validated, and they don't, they're trying to figure out how they're going to go backwards in security to be, there's a lot around encryption to unpack. And so if you've figured out encryption and you've got that implemented for CMMC, then that is really kind of a, as I think on the next slide, the canary in the coal mine for your preparation for CMMC. So of the companies that, if you turn the cube another way to look at it to see how encryption impacts things, then encryption as a security maturity indicator, 73% of companies that have fully implemented encryption are also fully documented. This makes sense. This is not rocket science. That statistic makes perfect sense. 65% have detailed POAMs. So I might expect that to be a little bit higher, but again, the POAMs are, you might have a perfect roadmap, you might have perfect documentation, but you just haven't completed the actions that you need to take to be technically ready for CMMC yet. So that kind of tracks as well. 75% have advanced third-party access controls in place, so that also makes sense. And this was surprising to me, and this is a good sign, I think, for Summit 7 and all of the companies that do managed security services, that of the companies that are that advanced, they are paying attention to the fact that continuous monitoring is a really important piece of being cyber aware and cyber secure and being effective in cybersecurity in general. And then 74% have formal vendor management programs as well. Oh my God, you guys are great. I wish you guys could see the screen. They're pushing the screen along in great big blown up images for me, because it is just the most accommodating thing I've ever seen okay. So Mrs. Magoo, I guess, or Dr. Magoo or whatever. Implications for the supply chain security. So this one I really love is the advanced controls in practice. 66% of the companies have advanced controls for managing CUI in place for third-party access. And again, because this is a supply chain, the ultimate goal of CMMC is supply chain security. That makes sense, and that's a bit reassuring. But the fact that a smaller percentage, 29%, have just some controls in place. I guess, if you're on the roadmap and you're not saying that you're ready for CMMC yet, then that's pretty good. And then the smaller percentages have really big gaps, or they're uncertain about where they are in their readiness for managing CUI across the supply chain, and that is a little worrisome. It feels good that it's such a small percentage, but it's worrisome that they are a part of the DIB and they're so poorly prepared at this point. And this is something that I think will resonate with everyone. Just the findings are interesting, no matter where you are in your CMMC preparedness. And that is the greatest perceived CMMC challenges. And honestly, I don't think it's a big surprise that the biggest percentage of concern is budgetary resources and constraints. And then scope complexity. I was really happy to see this in the survey, because to me, that's the number one problem, not whether or not you're technically ready on any given control, but rather, what are you putting the controls on top of? And when we're doing advisory work for an individual client, we talk about, they want to jump in on access controls and start talking about their preparedness for that. And no, we got weeks of work to do before we do that. We have to understand what contracts you have that have CUI in them, and what your where your contracts people send that information, and where it goes from there, and where it goes from there, and where it goes from there until it exits the organization. And then once we understand what is in terms of CUI flow, then we have to understand what you want it to be. So can we reduce the footprint of that? And it's not until you get to that point that you can start talking about, all right, let's start talking about controls, but then not until you understand all the assets that are in scope related to that environment. So the fact that there is a relatively large percentage of companies, 12%, that consider scoping their biggest challenge, to me is a reassuring thing, that feels more advanced, and that feels like an important thing, and that feels like where everybody should be, that should be the starting point. Executive buy-in, this is not a terribly big surprise that 19% feel that they don't have buy-in from their organization. And I want to go on a slight tirade here about that in particular. I feel like, as I said, I was a professor in cybersecurity and IT and web development and all that baloney many, many moons ago. And even back then, we talked about security like it was a cost center. We have to contain the cost. We have to reduce IT. We have to reduce the budget for that. It's a necessary evil. Cybersecurity is absolutely a strategic initiative at this point. And I also don't want to hear ever again in my entire life that compliance does not equal security. That's absolutely true, but it's missing the point. It's a sarcastic thing that people say, that you can cut corners to be compliant, but if you're, if you're taking the opportunity, if the IT people can talk to the executive leadership and say, we really need to take this seriously, and compliance is a foot in the door to more effective cybersecurity. If we can be compliant with NIST 800-171, that is a starting point for better cybersecurity. And if you're a really small company and you're struggling with the cost of all this, that is heartbreaking and it's really difficult, and a lot of people in the ecosystem are working really hard to figure out the solution to that, to reduce the cost as much as they possibly can of assessments, of solutions, of advisory work related to that. However, you should also recognize that if you are the smallest company in the DIB, you're probably one of the smartest companies in the DIB. So you're where the engineering magic happens that really drives the innovation of the products and services that the prime contractors are offering. And you might think that because you're small, you're not a target, but if you're small, you are the #1 target, because you're not expected to have robust cybersecurity in place. You do have the most innovative pieces to what is going on in the DIB, and you're usually a foothold into the larger companies as well. So most of the attacks on small companies that are successful don't stop there. They figure out, and it's pretty easy too. I mean, just think about the email access that your project managers have to next in line there, and maybe another couple steps up the food chain. So once you get a foothold into a small company, it's really easy to leapfrog through the supply chain related to that. So if you're here and you're in IT and you're trying to figure out how to improve executive buy-in and improve your budget, use some scary statistics about the current breaches that are happening in the DIB, and I can send you some case studies on some of the small companies that were breached that led to larger breaches. And in the DIB alone, I heard a statistic yesterday at CMMC Day, just in the DIB there's $600 billion lost to breaches every year, and it's getting worse. So cybersecurity is expensive. Cybersecurity breach is more expensive. So CMMC compliance is an opportunity to get started and to get buy-in and to do better in general. End of diatribe. And then budgeting for CMMC. This was also not terribly surprising, but also a little bit heartbreaking that the larger slice of the pie there is companies that they have a budget, but it's fixed and they have to stay within that budget, and there's not a whole lot of room. So if you're one of those companies that is in the process of doing a gap analysis and you haven't completed all your POAMs and you haven't figured out how much it's going to cost to go forward with everything, then that that may be a problem. So you might need to go back and get more executive buy-in from that. And then below the black one is you have an approved budget and it's not static, and understand that. And I would guess another thing I should have said at the beginning is that these are correlations, they're not causal. But I would expect there to be a correlation between large companies and large budgets. And I would expect there to be a correlation between medium-sized companies and some budget that may not be as robust as it needs to be. But there are companies, or some here in the room, who started on this journey feeling like it would cost them $100,000, a couple $100,000, and they're now over $1 million in the cost of compliance. But they understand the importance of it because they understand the industry that they're in, they understand that they're a target, that their industry is a target, and they've made the commitment to keep going and to keep doing what they need to get compliant. I also want to say another thing related to budgeting is that, more related to what I was saying earlier for the smaller companies who just don't have cybersecurity on their radar, and as a result of that, cybersecurity, if you haven't made any investments at all, then there's going to be a much bigger expenditure just to get prepared for CMMC. But it's going to incrementally increase from there going forward, so we can expect that. But again, it's a strategic initiative. We wouldn't cut corners on other expenses that need to be in place related to sales and marketing and whatever the accountants need to do their job. So we need to start thinking about cybersecurity in the same vein. It's a strategic part of what our information is, our biggest asset. And if we're not protecting it effectively, then that becomes a problem. So again, for those smaller companies that I am guessing make up the smaller slices of the pie that you don't have any budget, talk to your executives about the importance of this, and understand that compliance with CMMC is a foot in the door to being more cyber secure, and that being more cyber secure is a really important strategic initiative for the health of your organization. So what does success look like? So successful compliance requires evolving strategies, and you just need to dive in at some point, and you need to figure out what needs to be done. And so in the progression, let me talk a little bit now about doing a gap analysis. If you are on a shoestring budget and you are a deer in the headlights with cybersecurity, one of the things that I would recommend as a starting point related to all of this is help one person in your company go through at least CCP training, because that will give that one person kind of a foundation of everything that the assessors are going to be looking for. It'll give them an understanding of all the domains of cybersecurity control, and it will allow that person to be more effective in doing a gap analysis. And for picking that person to help you with your gap analysis, then one of the most important things that you need to make sure is that that person has authority. One of the worst strategies that we've seen in helping companies is hiring a third party to come in, and that, like a one person and a consultant, and that consultant's going to be in charge of making sure that you follow your roadmap and get ready for CMMC. That person has no authority. You have to have a person that has authority. It can boss around Bob in accounting and Sue in marketing and say, I need this and I need it by this date, and I need for you to get HR. They need to have gravitas in the organization. So you need to pick someone for that. You need to make sure that they're trained appropriately, and you need to give them what the tools that they need to get started. So that's a starting point in the gap analysis. The other thing related to what we talked about earlier, the next step I would say is, if you're doing a gap analysis, is to conduct your scoping exercise. Start with your people in contracts and understand what clauses exist in those contracts. Follow the trail of those clauses throughout the organization and where CUI is flowing. figure out, as I said earlier, figure out whether or not, once you identify what your data flow diagram looks like, identify whether that's what you want it to look like. If you can reduce the footprint, then think about how you're going to do that. A common thing that we see is multiple people are using multiple clouds. You really only need one. You need to reduce the number of people who have access to that. If everybody in engineering has access to CUI, but 2 people need to have access, then just make those 2 people privileged. So every way that you can reduce the footprint reduces the cost of compliance. So that's really important. If you feel like you don't have a person in your organization that can help you with that gap analysis and you want to hire someone, then there are a lot of companies out there. You can go to the Cyber AB website, the marketplace. There's a ton of RPOs and C3PAOs and RPs, and I would advise you that if you're going to ask for a third party to help you, that you look for someone who has at least a CCP, preferably a CCA, who has also experience in cybersecurity. You should ask them questions related to your ecosystem and platform, your infrastructure. So if you're a Microsoft shop, then you want to talk to someone who understands something related to Microsoft. So all of those, ask those key questions of the people that you seek help from for the gap analysis. And then beyond that, documentation is also really important. And one of the things that I wanted to say about documentation that is beyond what was covered here is that we've been talking about documentation as policies and procedures, and those are really important, and you have to get them absolutely right. The more you can standardize them, the better. And I mean, like, if you have multiple locations, if you have 3 different plants that do basically the same functions, and you can standardize what those policies, procedures say across those 3 plants, and that's going to help you not just with compliance, but it's going to help you manage your cybersecurity footprint a lot better just by having one set of concepts to manage there. But beyond that, the other thing that I wanted to say about documentation, again, is policies and procedures, but it's also how you prepare for CMMC. So there are multiple ways that the assessors can come in and ask for evidence, but the better your documentation about how you comply, then the better off you're going to be. And so when my team is doing advisory work and preparing a company for CMMC, one of the things we try to be lighthearted about everything. And one of the things that we say sort of in a lighthearted way is our goal is to have you not talk to the assessors any more than necessary. And so the more compelling of a story you can tell, here is our network diagram, here's how our data flow diagram maps to that. Here is a list of all of our assets that are in scope, out of scope, security protection assets, et cetera. And then here is our system security plan, and here is documentation. The ideal, which is almost impossible to meet, but it should be an ideal that you have in your head, is to have 2 pieces of documentation against every control. And then tell the story about how those 2 pieces of documentation tell the story to meet that requirement. And by the way, we're not looking at 110 controls, we're looking at 320 security objectives. So it's a lot of documentation. It's a library rather than, a small little manual. But that documentation will save you a lot, because you don't want to hand over your documentation to the assessors and have them come in and start asking a bunch of questions immediately about, well, can you explain this to me? You don't want to hear that right out of the gate. You want to hear, oh, okay, this makes sense and that makes sense, and we're just going to confirm some things here for you. So I think that I wanted to leave a little extra time for questions, because I thought, if some of you are nerdy academics like me, you probably want to dig into a couple of the statistics and unpack those and ask questions. So I'm going to open it now for questions.
All right. Plenty of time for questions in person and online. We had a bunch of stuff queued up online, but does anybody have questions here in the room first?
And then go to the beginning.
Don't be shy. All right. We'll start with online first. Amy, people were very interested in the budgeting data that you had on some of these slides. And they said that you called out information on budgeting approvals, but was there any insight or figures on actual budgets allocated?
Not from this survey, unfortunately.
Everybody, if you know your history about rulemaking, does everybody know what the DoD recommends as the general amount of your budget you're supposed to allocate to security? Any guesses as a percentage of your overall revenue? Bueller? It's a real number. It's a non-zero number. It's 0.5%. 0.5% is what the DoD thinks should be sufficient. So, yes, we're all laughing. Yes. Yeah, so imagine how big you would have to be for 0.5% to cover all your costs of CMMC, right? DoD's here in the room. I won't point them out, but you can laugh at them. You can laugh at them for that. It's a real number. Does anybody have questions in the room? No? Okay, we still have plenty online. Somebody else was asking, were there any questions or data about how long it took a company to implement the controls on their journey towards compliance?
Normally my answers to these questions are really long, but again, the answer is no.
Do you have any insight maybe from your experience from outside the report for what you've seen?
Well, in general, it takes most of the companies that we work with 12 to 18 months if they are just getting started in preparation. So if we're doing a gap analysis for a company, what we provide is a roadmap to completion. And what we do in our gap analysis is exactly what I just explained. We go through the tracking of the CUI data flow. We create the data flow diagram for you. We discuss whether that's what you want it to be. And then we go through the controls really quickly. So the first round is to just see, is this met or not met? And then once we have identified the ones that are not met, then we dig in on those and help them identify solutions. And then we'll go through, what we'll do is we'll say, okay, you're a Microsoft company, to meet this requirement, here are 3 possible options. Think about it. The next time we come back to you for a round of discussions, then you can tell us which one you want, and then we'll help you identify what the budget looks like for that and the time for implementation for that. But it's an iterative process. I don't know if that's secret sauce that I'm giving away and anyone's going to yell at me for telling the way we do gap analyses, but we find that then gives the company complete confidence in a roadmap, and then that roadmap they can take and implement from there. So doing the gap analysis is between 8 weeks and 8 and 13 weeks, depending on how much of a mess your CUI data flow is. And then the roadmap to completion depends on how many things you have to implement, how many gaps there were, how many things are on your POAM. And on average, it's a year to 18 months. We have seen companies be ready in 6 months. We've seen companies take many years.
So why don't we do our own informal survey here in the room? It's a little bit of an audible. How many of you have completed a CMMC for record certification?
Close your eyes, Bruce.
Okay, keep your hands up. How many of you took more than 18 months? Keep your hands raised. Exactly what I thought.
But I was told we could get it in 2 weeks. I was told we press a button and it's 2 weeks, and everybody who said it takes longer than 2 weeks is putting profits over national security or some nonsense. Imagine telling a company like ours who sells these things to make money that we're purposely making people take too long. Doesn't make any sense.
I have to say that you saying that means so much, though, because a lot of companies selling solutions are saying this is a solution. So if you're a provider of something that supports the DIB and you're not saying that this will fast track and this is easy if you just buy our product, that is an amazing amount of integrity and applause for that mentality.
Any other questions in the room?
So somebody online just wanted you to go maybe a little bit deeper on that, Amy. Do you feel like in your experience, what you've seen in the field lines up with what the report showed? Do you feel like maybe the situation on the ground is worse? Is it better? Is it pretty much down the middle as far as what your experience reflects?
We tend to not ask these sorts of questions of our clients. We let them volunteer if they want to, so I don't really probe them too much about whether they have executive buy-in, whether they have enough money, if they want to volunteer that. I assume that they're committed to compliance if they are here talking to us about getting ready. So I don't have a lot of there isn't a lot of crossover between the questions that were asked by our sister company, Coalfire, and what we discover in performing gap analyses and assessments with clients. But I will say one of the things that I'm really grateful for in the assessment process that we now actually have as of middle of December is the thoroughness of the pre-assessment process and the fact that we can gather evidence and know whether or not a client is ready for assessment as the assessor before we begin the assessment. So that's super helpful in not wasting anybody's time or money. So we do have the ability to, I feel, to get a pretty good beat on people's readiness before they come in to be assessed. And we've actually had one company say we want to flip our investment to a gap analysis based on how the pre-assessment went. So there is the opportunity for that.
Joy Beelan, Summit 7. Amy, thank you so much. I love how you've presented this data. I'm going to ask you to go away from the report for a minute. The part about the people who actually do IT and security diverging so greatly as a percentage for what is their readiness from what the executives are saying, especially in the documentation or policy area. Can you kind of speak to your experience with why there's that gap and what can we do as an industry to kind of bring that closer together?
Yeah, absolutely. So, or at least the first part I can speak to. I think that there's just classically been a gap between how the executives perceive things and how IT perceives things. And IT might think of cybersecurity and compliance with CMMC as a strategic initiative. The CEO is thinking about how to improve the bottom line, and anything that can be pushed down that looks like a cost, they're going to do that. So they might think that minimal measures are more adequate than the people that really understand the nuance of what needs to be done in order to improve that. And as an industry, when I was a professor, one of the things that I did is I taught executive courses on return on security investment. And we had a lot of fun with that, and it would be, normally for big companies where we would invite in the executives and the IT staff, and we'd have fun using each other's acronyms and trying to, they would guess what the other's acronyms meant and how to, and by the goal of the workshop was to explain to them how to speak to each other in a cohesive way so that the IT people really understood the bottom line matters. So if you're going to make a recommendation for an investment, you have to take into consideration how that's going to impact our budget. So the way IT people need to speak to that is to say, here's what the breach numbers look like, here's what it costs to be compliant. And that is a compelling argument right there in that there's a huge disparity between here's the likelihood that we'll be breached if we don't have these controls in place, and here's what that will cost. If we have these controls in place, it will cost us this much to put them in. So that's a good way to talk to the executives to help them understand. They're never going to be interested in the minutia, and the IT people are always going to be more worried about the details of every policy and procedure and setting on the devices and all of that. But I think the more that we can just extend olive branches, I think that is one of the most important things that we can do. So don't approach your boss like you're an idiot. Approach your boss like, I really want to help you understand what this means to you. And I really want to understand why you, how you feel about, what you would need from me in order for me to justify this expenditure to you. So what's the middle ground? And take out the resistance in communications. That's the biggest problem. Forget about cybersecurity. The biggest problem that we have in the world right now is the inability to communicate with each other effectively and extend all branches and look at each other's perspectives on things. But
okay. So one of the questions here online, speaking of executive perceptions, they asked, why do you think there's a significant discrepancy in the perception gap on documentation status between CEOs at 80% and the actual documentation itself at 61%. So why do you think there's this overestimation at the senior levels of companies?
I think it's just that just what I was speaking to a minute ago, is that they tend to feel like minimal investments are enough. They don't have enough nuanced understanding of what exactly needs to be done, so they don't really understand at the depth of level. So if you're, I like using layman's terms on for things. So if you might have the perspective that you're fit because you're running a mile now and you weren't running before. But if you set your goal to be a marathon runner, then you realize that being able to run a mile is a really small benchmark. And so the CE's perspective is, well, we want to be compliant with this thing out here. And the IT manager is looking at, in order to comply with that, then there are 320 objectives and all of these domains, and understanding the data flow and understanding the scope and understanding and getting Betty in HR to run the darn security awareness training. And there's a lot of cats to herd that in the making of the sausage, the IT people have clarity on all the details in a lot more significant way than the CEO does. The CEO is like, okay, I've sanctioned money to be spent on this. Go forth and prosper. We're done. I wrote the check. So I think there's a bit of that.
So you mentioned readiness a minute ago. Questions over here. When you are talking to a company that thinks they may be ready for their C3PAO assessment to get their CMMC level 2 accreditation, what would be the top 2 or 3 things that would be immediate red flags, or just what are the things that as you're talking to them you uncover and you say, and they realize and you realize they're really not ready yet?
So are you talking about as an assessment client or as an advisory client?
Either one.
Okay, so advisory, that's not nothing is a red flag, because we can help you improve your posture wherever your starting point is if you're advisory. If you're an assessment client, in the pre-assessment process, we're looking for completeness of the form. So we're just looking for a quick check of, is there an SSP, and does the SSP reflect that you have considered all 320 objectives and all 110 controls, et cetera. Does the data flow diagram make sense against the network diagram? Do you have a complete asset inventory? Does the asset inventory jive with both the network diagram and the data flow diagram? So we're looking for some general completeness, and lack of completeness in any of those would be a red flag that you're not ready for assessment. Those would be the main things that we're looking for at that level. If we're doing before that, if we're on a scoping call, the sales team often calls me in to talk with a company that is thinking about working with us. And if we're doing the scoping exercise of their readiness, then I'll often ask questions about, like, some companies will say, well, we want an assessment in 3 months, but we don't have an SSP. So.
Okay, Amy, so one more question, then we'll go on break, give everybody a little bit more time on the break this time around. So from online, fellow academic here, the survey participation spread is impressive across the company sizes. However, due to the size of the DIB and the given sample size of 209 in the study, do you believe that saturation was reached with this study?
Again, this was not my study. I didn't see the raw data, so I don't really have a best guess on that. But I do agree with whoever is on that, that this is it is kind of disparate, that it's kind of equal. It doesn't make sense that it would be equal, because there's definitely fewer large companies than there are medium and small are the biggest percentage, and yet they're an equal percentage. So I'm not sure how they picked who they were going to survey. So I do agree that it doesn't necessarily reflect the population of the DIB, though.
All right, thank you very much, Amy. I appreciate it.
All right, Amy Williams, everybody.